U.S. deportation of Haitians.
The U.S. government has deported thousands of Haitian refugee seekers back to their crisis-hit country. The United States' inhumane treatment of Haitian asylum seekers and migrants involves policies designed to deter specific nationality from entering the country, put in place decades earlier.
No! Hey, you use your women? This is why your country because you use your women for this. You go, that way.
Hello everyone and welcome to We the People. I am your host, Danny Arya. In this episode, we will investigate the U.S. government's hatred towards Haitians, which is part and parcel of the anti-migrant and xenophobic strategy culminating at the southern border with Mexico, where for years, thousands of refugee seekers have been stranded before being sent away. Thank you for joining us.
There is not enough food to give to everybody who's inside there. We need to get out of the camp to look for food. Things are worse.
It is these pictures of Border Patrol agents on horseback pushing migrants into the river that have caused so much anger. For some, they carry the echoes of the worst chapters of American history.
What we witness takes us back hundreds of years. What we witnessed was worse than what we witnessed in slavery. Cowboys with their reins again whipping black people, Haitians, into the water.
The recent mass migration of Haitians was in part caused by a magnitude 7.2 earthquake as well as tropical storms that affected the entire impoverished nation. The July assassination of President Jovenel Moïse further exacerbated violence and instability in the Caribbean country.
Disregarding the human suffering, the Biden administration has already deported thousands of migrants, according to official estimates. Now that comes on top of the thousands of others deported in previous administrations, including the 12,000 Haitian migrants indefinitely detained in Guantanamo in the 1990s. We're now joined by Dr. Adrienne Pine, a professor of anthropology at American University. She's also an author, and her latest book is titled Asylum for Sale, Profit and Protest in the Migration Industry. Thank you for joining us, Professor.
Oh, my pleasure.
Now, ma'am, first of all, what does the fact that the U.S. is deporting Haitian refugee seekers back say about Washington's claims of promoting human rights across the globe?
You know, it's particularly ironic that there's talk of sending Haitians to Guantanamo Bay, which, of course, Haitians were kept at an offshore really concentration camp in Guantanamo Bay in the early 1990s during the crisis following the U.S.'s support of the ousting, the coup against Aristide in Haiti. And but what's ironic is this is, Guantanamo is in Cuba. It's land that the United States has not returned to the nation of Cuba, and it's a site where the worst human rights violations that one can imagine are carried out. And meanwhile, the United States has been hemming and hawing about the supposed violations of human rights that Cuba is committing. And it really is mind-boggling to think that the United States claims itself to be a promoter of human rights and is punishing other countries and is issuing sanctions against other countries that are starving their populations and, harming their health in the middle of a pandemic, when in fact the United States is doing things that are far, far worse. This represents a huge threat to the people of Haiti, which is, really sort of piling on top of so many other insults and injuries that the United States has committed through coups, through acts of violence, and against Haitians in Haiti, and now by violating international refugee law by preventing Haitians, denying them their right to seek asylum in the country they choose. It's really, really outrageous.
Thank you, ma'am. Professor Adrienne Pine there joining us.
The United States' brutal deportation of Haitian migrants and refugee seekers is wreaking havoc not just among human rights advocates, but also within the American public. President Biden won the Democratic nominee as well as the presidential election by claims of supporting human rights and promoting liberal values.
Yet the mass deportation effort is laying bare the depth of U.S. disregard for those claims under his administration. Refugee and asylum seekers often embark on a lengthy journey to get to America. Many recount being kidnapped several times and released only after paying drug cartels a hefty ransom. To get a better perspective, we've also invited Mr. Kim Ives, an independent filmmaker and commentator. He's also editor at Haiti Liberté. Welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you.
Now, Mr. Ives, given profound instability in the Caribbean nation, how do you think the fate of the refugee seekers is going to pan out?
Well, they appear to be letting some refugees come into the U.S. to try to blunt the outcry, both national and international, against the treatment the Haitians have been receiving. But they are still sending flights. These past few days, they have been sending 4 or 5 flights a day of Haitians back to Haiti. But this may end up being a huge miscalculation on this part, because right now there is a revolution brewing in Haiti. Haiti's huge underclass, the lumpen proletariat of Haiti, is being forged into a force of resistance right now by an alliance of armed neighborhood groups who the bourgeoisie of Haiti used to give guns to settle their scores and fight their political battles.
Thank you for joining us, Mr. Kim Ives, here on We the People.
Corrupted authorities and criminals extort migrants every chance they get in countries on the way, such as Mexico. Many officials, cartels, and criminals are making a fortune by exploiting those seeking a better chance to live.
Nosotros los haitianos que viajan a pie, que coge todo lucha para llegar aquí, que gasta muchos dineros y ellos llegan aquí. Nosotros se piden al gobierno que se apoyamos a nosotros, que dan papeles, porque algunos de nosotros si encuentra papeles puede empezar a trabajar, puede ganar plata, puede ganar una vida mejor. Después ellos pueden pensar a ir a otro país, pero como ellos no tienen ni papeles, no nada, ellos querían viajar al frontera de Texas.
There are still continuous reports of illegal crossings, detentions, and even murder and sexual abuse in regards to the migrants. Many of the migrants intend to join their loved ones on the other side of the border through Texas's Rio Grande Valley, the busiest corridor for illegal crossings. What is the difference in the way this administration handles immigration compared to the previous one?
The Biden administration is continuing the Trump administration policies, not only with respect to Haiti, and I could say all of Latin America, where it's keeping in place the sanctions against Haiti's neighbor Cuba, where it's keeping in place the war on Venezuela, where it's keeping in place the backing, or kept in place, the backing of President Jovenel Moïse up until his assassination. So on the border, it's the same thing. They are continuing, as I mentioned earlier, the metering, the Title 42, the keeping people at bay, and the verbiage of making things more humane and more what's the word I'm looking for, and more humane is all that they've stepped up. But as for the actual policies, no, they're essentially the same as the Trump administration policies.
The exclusionary policy against migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers, particularly those from Haiti, has a long history, and the Biden administration's course is just a continuation of brutal U.S. strategy. Today, Haitians are being whipped away from U.S. borders, reviving images of black people being whipped in cotton fields by white men on horseback.
The images coming out of encampment along the Del Rio International Bridge in Texas are not only heartbreaking, but also a telltale of how much Washington cares about human rights and suffering. The U.S., meanwhile, employs the human rights excuse mostly to intervene in the internal affairs of other nations.
You know, the refugees who are currently being deported in violation of their international right to seek asylum using Title 42, which is a racist policy implemented by Trump's advisor, Stephen Miller, that the Biden administration has decided to continue using. Under that, these deportations, the Haitians who are being deported to Haiti are really going to be facing dire circumstances. A large number of them have actually been out of the country for around a decade, since the 2010 earthquake in Haiti that, as we know, killed hundreds of thousands of people. People fled. They went all over the Americas, large community in Brazil, in Peru. And many of those Haitians have residency in those countries. They actually have lives that they could go back to, and that wouldn't be necessarily, not what they're seeking, as they are seeking to come to the United States, but they would be better than what they face in Haiti, which is a country that is politically and, really otherwise infrastructurally devastated.
Now, whether Haitians are entering through the southern border or trying to get to Florida's shores by boat, what is clear is that the Biden administration does not intend on helping Haitians who are themselves victims of U.S. policies in Central America and the Caribbean. While President Biden needs to be held accountable, the administration has to respond. Why?
Well, the former special envoy to Haiti, Daniel Foote, essentially said that he didn't have a voice in this administration. He said that he was ignored. He also said he didn't want to be connected to what he saw as cruel and inhumane policies. He said that it was wrong to be deporting Haitians back to Haiti because that island nation is facing a number of crises, including the aftermath and political turmoil of the assassination of the president, as well as an earthquake that hit the country last month. I want to read part of Daniel Foote's letter because it was a blistering letter. It said in part, "I will not be associated with the United States' inhumane, counterproductive decision to deport thousands of Haitian refugees. The collapsed state," and he's referring to Haiti, "is unable to provide security or basic services, or more refugees will fuel further desperation and crime." So there he is saying that Haiti is actually being harmed by us sending back the United States sending back Haitian migrants.
The so-called illegal aliens are desperate human beings escaping violence, poverty, and mafia. They had left Haiti in the hopes of fleeing persecution or seeking a better life. Yet now they face an uncertain future, hanging somewhere in the middle of a game played by the most powerful men in America.
The U.S. Special Envoy Daniel Foote has resigned in a blistering letter that he sent to the State Department, saying it was inhumane what they were doing, and basically decried the U.S. policy of sending people back into Haiti when it is in complete crisis following the July 7th assassination of President Jovenel Moïse, the August 14th earthquake, the August 16th tropical storm. The country is totally reeling underneath economic and financial crisis. And so sending these people back is just the height of cruelty. And at the same time, the U.S. is receiving 95,000 Afghan refugees. Why can't it receive a few Haitian refugees and asylum seekers as well?
The U.S. policies towards migrants has also created a crisis for Mexico. Mexico's border cities are not equipped to house, feed, and protect tens of thousands of refugees. Many of the cases of migrants forced to remain in Mexico ended with deportation orders from judges because they failed to show up for their immigration court hearing on the U.S. side of the border.
Immigration has always been essential to America. Let's end our exhausting war over immigration. For more than 30 years, politicians have talked about immigration reform, and we've done nothing about it. It's time to fix it. On day one of my presidency, I kept my commitment and sent a comprehensive immigration bill to the United States Congress. If you believe we need to secure the border, pass it because it has a lot of money for high-tech border security. If you believe in a pathway to citizenship, pass it. It's over 11 million undocumented folks, the vast majority of here overstaying visas. Pass it. We can actually, if you actually want to solve a problem.
Despite all the baseless promises, the immigrants have had to stay in places such as the Mexican state of Tamaulipas. In such places, rape, torture, and kidnapping are so pervasive that the U.S. State Department itself has a do not travel advisory on.
Making a calculus here, he's thinking about which American publics matter more. It really has to do with internal politics. There's a large number of people in the United States who are very anti-migration and very anti-migrant, and he's trying to appear tough on crime, whatever the costs, including the cost being the lives of and well-being of Haitian asylum seekers. And, you know, then there are, of course, large numbers of people who care about human rights. And, you know, I think the problem is that the human rights aren't negotiable. This should not be a domestic political issue, which is really what it is. Biden is just sort of following the electoral winds and thinking, you know, that you know, the Democratic Party might lose in the next elections in Miami or Texas because they're letting in all of these, you know, Haitian immigrants. But that's not the issue here. I mean, that, you know, I believe that regardless of what the majority of the American people think, and I actually don't know how that would break down. It would depend on how you'd ask the question. But I think we do believe ourselves to be a nation that respects human rights.
Now, the Haitian migrants, they take on a deeply harrowing journey in brutal temperatures of up to 40 degrees centigrade. While in Mexico, many of the asylum seekers are targeted by criminal gangs and drug cartels. Many children are sexually abused or employed for dangerous crimes. The dire conditions of the Haitian migrants are definitely going to worsen as they are deported away from the U.S. amid silence by many politicians and top U.S. decision makers.
As many as 80% of migrants have been victimized, according to reports by human rights organizations. Emboldened by U.S. anti-migration attitude, bandits of violent drug and people smuggling gangs find no reason to show mercy to the victims.
Well, I think the world has been witnessing one of the great human rights travesties this past weeks as the situation at the border continues to worsen. Already, we know that the Biden administration has kept wholesale most of the Trump administration's policies, such as metering. This is where they have to, where immigrants can't come into the U.S. to ask asylum. They have to wait in another country, like Mexico, usually in squalid camps, and get a number and wait for their number to arrive, which can be months, even years.
The embarrassing treatment of Haitians today comes in the backdrop of at least 4 years of Republicans' zero-tolerance agenda to block the southern border in order to make it more difficult for the migrants to enter the United States. Former President Trump was notorious in his anti-migrant and xenophobic policies, which he kept promoting with backing from the GOP base.
We will build a great wall along the southern border, and Mexico will pay for the wall. On day one, we will begin working on an impenetrable, physical, tall, powerful, beautiful southern border wall. After meeting with their wonderful, wonderful president today, I really believe they want to solve this problem along with us, and I'm sure they will.
With a Democratic government in power in the White House, many rights activists expected the situation to change, but to no avail. The massive crackdown on migration puts on display the core ideologies in Washington in favor of cracking down on victims arriving at U.S. borders rather than helping them. The Trump administration was notorious for exercising zero tolerance at the U.S. border with Mexico. So, what is the difference between the Trump administration and the current one in terms of dealing with migration at the southern border?
You know, we're really seeing very little difference at all. And this is not surprising to those of us who know Biden's history. He, in fact, as vice president to Obama, they really started up the incarceration, the levels of immigrant detention that we're seeing now, and that hasn't been reduced. But more importantly, as I mentioned, Title 42, which is an explicitly racist, xenophobic policy that was really floated by Stephen Miller even before the pandemic. Stephen Miller being the racist advisor to President Trump. It was floated as a way to prevent brown and black people from coming into the United States. The pandemic gave them the perfect excuse to say that migrants pose a public health risk.
Please stay tuned for more.
Denying migrants a chance to seek asylum is indeed at the heart of America's policies. This is while many of the victims find themselves under these conditions due to decades of U.S. intervention in countries such as Haiti, as well as others in Central and Southern America. With images of Haitians' expulsion going viral, politicians from both sides of the aisle are taking the chance to take advantage of the heated power play over immigration.
It is essentially broken down along the lines that we've seen in recent years with the election of Donald Trump. We have an extremely xenophobic and reactionary part of the American population, which sees immigrants or has swallowed the lie that immigrants are the cause of their misfortune and their growing poverty and their growing lack of services. And yet there is, I could say, a growing percentage of the population, which is not only black or brown or engaged on a level that allows them understand these dynamics, but they are, in fact, in solidarity and understand that the plight of immigrants from Haiti and from the rest of Latin America, for that matter, is the same as their own. So I think there has been an outpouring of outrage and solidarity and indignation at what they're seeing happening on the border. The pictures, again, of the border agents on their horses, just like in the days of slavery 2 centuries, a century and a half ago, it has recalled these images. And people are saying, enough is enough. We cannot treat people like this.
Now, Republicans say that Joe Biden was the one who led Haitians to believe that they could seek asylum in America, as Democrats expressed outrage. Fate of the victims, meanwhile, matters to no one. Here at We the People, we wish all migrants well, no matter where they are, and pray for their safety and well-being. Well, that was our show, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. I'm your host, Daniel Arya. Make sure you join us next week for another episode of We the People. Bye-bye for now.